Workplace democracy is the topic of today's talk, and it's at the heart of what you're arguing in loads of articles during the last decades. But before we go there, I read some articles of you, and I really had serious insights on a topic that seems to be remote, on the topic of slavery. Why do we have to talk about slavery when we talk about modern workplace decision-making and democracy?
Right. Well, slavery is often used as a hyperbole to describe work, but I'm not using it that way. I'm using it as going back to the intellectual arguments about slavery and not talking about historical slavery, but what were the arguments that the supporters of the slavery system used to try to justify it in Western thought. And the relevance is that they constructed arguments based on contracts, because the normal view of slavery is it was all coercion, and that may well be true historically, but that's not the legal arguments that were made. The legal arguments were made that it was based on some sort of a contract, and there were various forms of that contract. One was, for example, if you are, in Roman law, if you're captured as a prisoner of war, then they can kill you, or you can be sold into slavery. And so that was the sort of tough decision you had to make. And the Romans got nothing out of you if they killed you, but they get something out of you if they sell you as a slave. So the theoretical argument for American slavery was that all the slaves sold on the African coast to the slave ships were actually prisoners of war from wars internal in Africa. So we did not enslave anybody. You know, these were all just commercial transactions, people that were already enslaved. So it was a contract. And so that argument, the abolitionist movement had to analyze not just the reality of slavery, but also the theoretical arguments in favor of allowing this contract, saying it should not be allowed and it should be abolished. Because the normal liberal theory is that you never abolish a free contract, you only allow choices. If you don't like this contract, you take this contract. So why did liberalism abolish this contract? So they developed a theory that said there's something wrong with buying another person inherently. It doesn't matter if he's mistreated or ill-fed or ill-housed and overworked and whipped and all that. That's all consequentialist, pragmatic arguments. There's something wrong with it in theory. And therefore, the right that the slave would alienate if he did sign such a contract should be an inalienable right. And that is relevant because what we have today is a system where workers are rented instead of purchased. So in a slavery, if you had a voluntary slavery system as a hypothetical system, they would be selling all their labor once for their whole lifetime. And that was very inconvenient for the masters because then you had to support the slaves during good times and bad. Whereas if you just rent them, then in bad times you can just lay them off and then hire them back in good times. And that's the system we have today, is where you have the employer-employee contract. So that's why the intellectual argument about slavery as a contract is relevant to the argument today about the employment contract. Because one is just the purchase contract where you buy all the labor at once. The other is the rental contract where you buy the labor by the hour, by the day, by the week, or whatever the time period is. And it turns out that the deeper arguments against allowing a voluntary slavery contract also apply to the rental contract. That it also, that's why it's relevant. So we're not making, hyperbolic statements that, oh, it's like slavery to work in a factory or an office. It's not. No, but that's just a silly argument. We're taking the intellectual arguments that were developed in Western thought against slavery, even as a contractual institution, and saying those arguments, once understood, apply also against the rental system, and that's what we have today.
Mm-hmm. So if I get you right, and if we take serious how people try to justify slavery in the past, they did this on the basis that humans have the right to make contracts about their life however they want. Yeah. And you're arguing, actually, that is still present nowadays. Still present nowadays. We seem to have the right to sell our existence to other people. And if I get you right, you're not critical about, insofar as, well, this is now slavery. But you say, actually, we miss the deeper philosophical point to break away from the system on which slavery was based.
Well, essentially, there were two great differences between historical slavery and what we have today. One is what we have today is voluntary. And there's a very superficial left-wing critique of it that says, well, I have higher standards of voluntariness. So you just sort of escalate your notion of voluntariness until almost no contracts would be voluntary. Because every contract, you have to make a choice. You have to give up something. You know, I'd rather get my house and not pay for it. I'd rather get my car and not pay for it, and so forth and so on. So this critique is not saying that the wage labor contract or the slavery contract were involuntary. There well could be situations in both cases where people really want to do that. It's a hard choice, but they want to do that. But nevertheless, there's something wrong with the contract because it's a contract that puts people in the legal position of a person of no capacity, in other words, as a thing, or of diminished capacity, as in the case of the hired labor contract, is you're like a rented thing on the job. None of the fruits of your labor, positive or negative, are yours. You're just a rented thing, and like a rented owner of a rented thing, you get the rental payment, the wage. Mm-hmm. And so that's the argument is that we can own a car, and we can transfer the car, rent it to somebody else. We can own an apartment, we can rent it out to somebody else, but we can't transfer ourselves out to be used or employed or hired or rented by somebody else. We as it were, always cooperate with them, and we're inexorably co-responsible for the results. And the way to see this is just to look at a hired labor contract where the employer tells the employee to commit a crime. And then the employee works together with the employer and robs a bank, say, and they get caught. And the judge says, we charge you both with the crime. And the worker says, no, I sold my labor quite voluntarily, so I'm no longer responsible. The judge says, I'm sorry, you're a responsible human being. When you chose to obey the employer telling you to rob the bank, that was your decision to rob the bank as well, and you're both responsible. And my point is exactly the same in a normal factory or a normal office floor. When you're still a responsible person working together with your bosses and you're co-responsible for all the results, and yet as a employee, you have zero claim on the product, you have zero, none of the liabilities are your cost, and you're just a rented instrument getting the rental payment.
Mm-hmm. So if I get you right, your argument against the present system of labor relations, against the present system of contracts about human labor is that the idea that I can rent out myself is not morally to be judged, but it's wrong if we observe how humans are functioning and how humans interact. Would you, because you say actually the idea that I can sell myself doesn't work, as we see in the example of crime. Is it a moral critique, or is it a critique that it's inconsistent how we see the economy nowadays? Well,
they boil down to be very close. It's a fact that a person cannot turn themselves into a part-time thing. I mean, you could have there are science fiction stories where people can turn themselves into things and rent themselves out. In that case, they would not be responsible for robbing the bank. But that's not what happens in the normal wage labor employment relationship. I think in German it's called labor giving and labor taking relationship. So it's a factual impossibility that human beings are like that. Human beings are not part-time persons and part-time things. They're always persons, and particularly on the job, they're still persons. And yet the contract says, well, when you're on the job, we're treating you just as a rented instrument. And if you look at the other historical contracts that have been abolished, the other one was the old marriage contract. And we call it in English law, French, it's called the coverture marriage contract, where the wife gave up her independent legal personality to become like an appendage or a dependent on the husband. So she could not own property in her own name, she could not make contracts in her own name. Now there is a legal condition where you're not allowed to make contracts in your own name, and that's when you're mentally enfeebled, you're senile, you're insane, something physical, so you're not a fully capacitated person. But the marriage contract was a fraud in the sense that you sign this contract, you legally are treated as if you were this person that didn't have these fully capable person, but yet you still were. And And so then what do you call fulfilling the contract since you don't turn yourself, in fact, into a, senile person or a person that doesn't have their faculties? And the answer is always obey. Obey the master, obey the employer, obey the husband. And so that's always counted as if that was fulfilling the contract to be a non-person or a part-time non-person or a person of diminished capacity, when in fact it's not. Obeying is a normal thing. When you have an agent that makes a decision for you and you're selling a house or a car or something, then you may take that decision and do it, but you're not, so obeying is a normal thing. It doesn't turn yourself into, all these contracts are fraudulent in the sense that they are legally treating a fully capacitated person, the slave, the coverture wife, or the employee, as if they had, in fact, lost some aspect of their personhood, and they haven't. They still have all those de facto, all those capacities. So it's a legalized fraud. And we've abolished the slavery contract, we've abolished the coverture marriage contract in the advanced countries. You can still do it in Saudi Arabia, perhaps, but and we still have the employment contract. And it's so prevalent.
And this, of course, now it seems like we have a philosophical argument or something, but at this point you get, dangerous. Because you put into question the substance about how we earn our money, be it as a person who employs somebody or somebody employed. Because actually, if your argument is taken seriously, and if I am rented out to rob a bank, I can't say I'm not part of it because I was rented. I have to take the negative burden of what the police does to me. The same thing, of course, should then apply if somebody rents me out in a business and the business runs a profit. That why shouldn't I get a part of the profit if I also get a part of the negative result if I rob a bank? So how do you solve this in modern economics? How can people who are nowadays employed get a serious part of the revenues of a firm?
Well, what we're doing is we're saying that the contract to rent a person is an inherently invalid contract. And so what do you have as work when you don't have employment? That means you are always a member of the company. So this would be like a worker cooperative or a company where it was a worker-owned company. And to work in the company is the same thing as being a member of the company. There's no such thing as being a hired hand that is not a member of the company. And so that's where it gets dangerous to the employers, because the employers, that's their whole business. And so, first of all, work is very different from employment. When you work for yourself, if you're an independent businessman, that's fine. There's no employment relationship. You're doing work. Or if you're in a small family business where you don't have employees, that's fine. You're not an employee, and you're working for yourself. And in a cooperative or a worker-owned business, it's the same thing. You're jointly working for yourselves. So you don't have employer and employee. You don't have one set of human beings renting another set of human beings. So yes, there'll still be work, but there won't be employment. And it's ridiculous that the employment relationship has become so acceptable that in America we consider it as a synonym to work. If you're out of work, we call it unemployment.
I know you don't like the counter-argument, but of course the counter-argument that is prevalent in this question is, well, okay, so you speak about cooperatives, common ownership, but haven't we tried that, for example, in Yugoslavia? Isn't that less efficient than our firm?
The Yugoslavia had part of the idea of bringing democracy to the workplace, but they tried to implement it under a Marxist regime, where you didn't have real ownership of the asset. It was social ownership. And so when workers have the right to the net income of the firm, and they choose to take part of it home and they choose to put part of it back in the firm, or whatever they put back in the firm, they lose. They become social ownership. And when things go bad and they for whatever reason, the firm is in jobs are being lost, there was no bankruptcy, that the firms were slowly rolled over into other firms, given soft loans by the government. So what you had in Yugoslavia was starting off as a good idea, but then was corrupted by being implemented in a socialist state. So what happened was they slowly became socially owned. They weren't employee owned, and that's where I went in 1990, moved to Yugoslavia, and tried to work with the we drafted a law there which would, when they privatize, would privatize to the workers in a Western form of employee ownership, which would be like a cooperative or like what in America is called an employee stock ownership plan, which has become quite successful in America to convert family firms into worker-owned firms, not huge Wall Street firms. And so we have 7,000 ESOPs in America and only a small number of cooperatives, unfortunately only about 300. But 10% of the American private workforce work in ESOP companies, whereas only 7% of the private workforce in America are in unionized companies. So within 40 years' time, this employee stock ownership plan has grown to surpass even the trade union movement in America. Mm-hmm. And yet Europeans hardly know about it. And so one of my, I spent half a year in Europe and half a year in California, and we were giving a series of talks around Europe to try to show there's a practical mechanism by which workers can buy their companies collectively without risking any of their own money, that the company itself is the collateral. So you don't mortgage your house or your car or your savings accounts. The collateral for the loan to buy out the old owner, to buy out the family owner, say, is the company itself. And rich people are always allowed to do that, to collateralize as whatever they're buying. And so there's now a legal mechanism for ordinary people to do that, for workers to do that. And it's been 40 years tested, 7,000 of them, and Europeans don't even know about it.
Mm-hmm. David, finally a short question. Do you think this idea that we go to work to a business that we own with the fellow people we work there, so these ideas of cooperatives, do you think that holds a strong future for Europe?
Corporatists? Which aspect are you talking about?
Well, I would, as far as I understand you, that you say there is a potential that new forms of working are growing within the current system.
Yes.
Do you see there's a potential for it in Europe?
Yes, well I think there should be more potential here. I mean, if you said that the pioneer form of worker ownership is actually in America, people would say that's crazy, that America is the most anti-labor country around, and particularly after Reagan and the neoliberalism. But ESOPs are supported by both sides for different reasons, Bernie Sanders as well as the right wing in America. So, but these are not things to convert the system. These are the things to show within the old system that there is an alternative. When you convert the whole system, that's a different thing. That would be something like saying every publicly traded company, we're going to re-charter and make the shareholders into creditors. So they're not the owners, they never have been the owners for a long time in any real sense, and turn the members of the company into the people that work there. Mm-hmm. So it would be a rechartering, say at the federal level of large corporations, and then work it down. And that's to get there, you have to have working examples to show that it actually works. And it's more efficient than it's not surprising, it's more efficient than the usual. People work harder and better, smarter for themselves and when they're working for an employer and making somebody else better off. So that's never been the problem. The problem is how do you get from here to there? And there is this mechanism so you can create a lot of working examples, work out a lot of bugs, perfect the system, and then at the same time you have the sort of the left wing, the Social Democrats, which we're working with in Scandinavia, which are now trying to redefine Scandinavian social democracy to include this sort of worker ownership. Not these so-called wage earner funds, which are national trade union owned, but companies owned by the people that work in the companies. So it's a different narrative. It's redefining social democracy. So rather than saying, well, we'll do all these universal programs, which will give you universal health care and universal free education, universal this and that, it's saying we will change the system so you will actually control your own life at the level of what you do all day long on the job. And that's something new. Okay. And that's what we're trying to foster. Mm.